In the winter of 1885, the elegant Fifth Avenue mansion of Elena Fairchild stood as a monument to one of New York's most shocking tragedies. Behind its limestone facade and gleaming windows lay secrets so disturbing that the city's most powerful men would go to extraordinary lengths to bury them forever. What began as a grieving widow's attempt to honor her husband's memory spiraled into a nightmare of conspiracy, murder, and madness, one that claimed not only Elena's sanity, but ultimately her life. Official records speak of suicide brought on by hysteria, yet recently discovered correspondence, hidden within the walls of a demolished Wall Street building, tells a far more sinister story. It is a story that reveals how the financial elite of the Gilded Age built their fortunes upon carefully orchestrated deaths, and how they silenced the one woman bold enough to expose their crimes. Before we continue with the tale of Elena Fairchild and the dark secrets that destroyed her, take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love hearing from our community of mystery enthusiasts around the world. The truth about what happened to Elena Fairchild begins not with her death, but with the mysterious circumstances surrounding her husband's final evening alive. New York City in 1885 stood at the pinnacle of America's Gilded Age, a glittering metropolis where unprecedented wealth flowed through the marble halls of Wall Street, while immigrants crowded into tenements just blocks away. The city's financial district pulsed with the energy of a new industrial empire, where railroad barons, steel magnates, and banking dynasties amassed fortunes that would have made European royalty envious. Along Fifth Avenue, palatial mansions rose like monuments to this American aristocracy. Their owners hosted elaborate dinner parties and charity galas that defined the social hierarchy of the entire nation. Among these titans of industry was Theodore Fairchild, a man whose financial acumen made him one of the most feared and respected figures on Wall Street. At 45, Theodore controlled a vast network of investments spanning railroads, mining operations, and manufacturing interests. His uncanny ability to predict market movements earned him the nickname the Oracle of Exchange Place. Rivals whispered that Theodore possessed an almost supernatural gift for knowing exactly when to buy or sell, often reaping enormous profits from the misfortunes of his competitors. In 1878, Eleanor Catherine Brennan married Theodore, transforming overnight from the daughter of a modest Boston merchant into one of New York's most prominent socialites. At 25, she possessed both refined beauty and sharp intelligence, making her the perfect complement to Theodore's ambitions. Elena had not married merely for wealth. She truly loved her husband and admired his brilliant mind. She devoted herself to the role of society hostess with remarkable skill, organizing charity events that raised thousands for the city's orphanages, and hosting intimate dinners where America's most powerful men conducted business over fine wine and imported cigars. The Fairchild Mansion at 847 Fifth Avenue reflected their status with perfection. Built in the fashionable French Second Empire style, the four-story limestone palace boasted soaring ceilings, hand-carved marble staircases, and rooms filled with European antiques and original paintings. The crown jewel of the estate was Theodore's private study, a wood-paneled sanctuary lined with leather-bound books and anchored by a massive safe where he kept his most confidential business documents. Eleanor had always respected her husband's need for privacy in his financial affairs, understanding that the world of high finance demanded absolute discretion. Though their union had initially been arranged through family connections, their marriage had blossomed into a genuine and enduring partnership. Theodore often sought Elena's counsel on social matters, recognizing her remarkable ability to read both people and situations. In turn, she had developed a refined understanding of business and finance through their many conversations, though she was always careful not to overstep the boundaries of what society deemed proper for a woman of her standing. They had no children, a private sorrow for Elena, but Theodore's devotion to his work and her dedication to their social obligations gave their lives a sense of purpose and meaning. New York in 1885 was a city of sharp contrasts. While the wealthy dined on 7-course meals in gilded dining rooms, newspaper headlines frequently reported financial panics that left thousands of working families destitute. The newly completed Brooklyn Bridge symbolized American ingenuity and progress, yet labor strikes and industrial accidents claimed lives with disturbing regularity. In this climate, men like Theodore Fairchild wielded enormous power, their decisions capable of shaping the livelihoods of thousands of workers and determining the fortunes of entire cities. What Elena did not yet realize was that her husband's extraordinary success had come at a cost far more dreadful than she could ever have imagined. The evening of November 17, 1885, began like countless others in the Fairchild household. Elena spent the afternoon preparing for one of their regular business dinners, ensuring every detail met Theodore's exacting standards. The dining room gleamed with polished silver and crystal, while the kitchen staff prepared a menu of roasted duck, imported oysters, and Charlotte Russe, Theodore's favorite dessert. These gatherings were more than social occasions. They were carefully orchestrated meetings where some of New York's most powerful financiers conducted their most sensitive business. That evening's guests included Heiress Kensington, a silver-haired banker who controlled much of the city's railroad financing; Marcus Cromwell, a sharp-featured man whose shipping empire dominated the East Coast ports; and James Wright, the youngest at 38, whose family's textile mills had made him enormously wealthy. Elena had hosted these men many times and had come to recognize the subtle dynamics among them. Theodore clearly commanded the role of leader, while the others deferred to his judgment with almost military precision. Yet as the evening unfolded, she sensed an unusual tension. The men's conversation, usually animated with talk of market opportunities and political affairs, carried an undercurrent of anxiety she had never witnessed before. During the soup course, she overheard fragments of hushed exchanges, mentions of the Pittsburgh situation, and veiled references to a problem that needed to be resolved permanently. When she attempted to lighten the mood with a remark about recent social gossip, the table fell silent, leaving her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Theodore, ordinarily attentive to her comfort, seemed distracted and unusually pale. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his wine glass, and beads of perspiration dotted his forehead despite the cool November evening. When she quietly asked if he felt unwell, he assured her it was merely the strain of a particularly complex negotiation, but his eyes held a haunted look she had never seen before. The dinner dragged on with increasing awkwardness. The men's voices dropped to barely audible murmurs whenever sensitive matters arose, and Elena found herself excluded from discussions that had once welcomed her keen observations on social and political life. She began to feel like an unwelcome guest in her own dining room, a sensation that both puzzled and wounded her deeply. It was during the serving of the Charlotte Russe that everything changed. Theodore had just lifted his spoon to his lips when he suddenly gasped, his face twisting in pain. The silver spoon clattered onto his plate as he clutched his chest, his breathing sharp and shallow. Elena rushed toward him, but before she could reach his side, Theodore collapsed forward onto the table, sending crystal glasses crashing to the floor and staining the white tablecloth with dark red wine that looked disturbingly like blood. "Theodore!" Elena's scream echoed through the mansion as she fell to her knees beside her husband's chair. His eyes were wide with terror, his lips moving as though trying to form words, but only a horrible, gasping sound emerged. Heiress Kensington quickly took control, sending Marcus Cromwell to summon the family physician while ordering the servants to clear the room. James Wainwright gently but firmly guided Elena away from Theodore's body, assuring her that Dr. Henley would know exactly what to do. Dr. Purcell Henley arrived within 20 minutes, his medical bag in hand and his expression grave with professional concern. Elenina watched from the doorway as he examined Theodore's still form, checking for vital signs with the practiced efficiency of a man long accustomed to emergencies among the city's elite. After what felt like an eternity, Dr. Henley straightened and shook his head solemnly. "I'm afraid Mr. Fairchild has passed away," he announced, his voice carrying both sympathy and authority. "Given his recent complaints of chest pain and the immense strain of his business affairs, I believe we are looking at a fatal heart attack. Such tragedies are, unfortunately, all too common among men of his age and position." In that moment, Elena's world collapsed. The man who had been her partner, her protector, and her greatest love was gone, taken from her without warning, without a final goodbye. Through her tears, she dimly registered the other men speaking in hushed tones with Dr. Henley, arranging for the body and discussing the legal formalities. Their swiftness seemed almost indecent, but she was too stricken with grief to question it. What she did not notice, however, were the brief, meaningful glances exchanged between the three surviving dinner guests, or the way Dr. Henley gave a subtle nod when Heiress and Kensington whispered something in his ear. She did not see Marcus Cromwell discreetly remove Theodore's wine glass and plate, nor James Waywright signaling the butler to clear the entire table with unusual haste. In the days that followed, as Elenina struggled to adjust to her new life as a widow, the official account of Theodore's death solidified. Newspapers reported that one of Wall Street's brightest minds had succumbed to the relentless pressures of high finance, a cautionary tale of ambition taken too far. Friends and colleagues offered their condolences, praising Theodore's remarkable career and lamenting the loss of such a gifted financier. But Elenina could not shake the memory of her husband's terrified eyes in those final moments, nor the unsettling behavior of his dinner companions. Something about that evening felt profoundly wrong, though she could not yet put into words what disturbed her so deeply. The weeks following Theodore's funeral drifted by in a haze of condolence visits and legal consultations. She soon found herself thrust into an unfamiliar world of financial documents, business partnerships, and legal obligations that had once belonged solely to her husband. Theodore's attorney, the distinguished Cornelius Dalton, guided her through the complexities of the estate with paternal kindness, gently suggesting that while the vast holdings were now legally hers, they might best be entrusted to more experienced hands. The scope of the Fairchild financial empire astonished her. Beyond the obvious railroad ventures and mining interests, Theodore had quietly assembled a sprawling network of investments that stretched across shipping companies, manufacturing concerns, newspaper enterprises, and banking partnerships. The paperwork seemed endless: stock certificates, bond holdings, partnership agreements, and correspondence with associates scattered across the continent. Each page required her signature. Each decision demanded her immediate attention. Yet what unsettled her most was the uncanny timing of Theodore's investments. Repeatedly, she discovered that her husband had made brilliant financial moves just days or weeks before catastrophic events struck the industry. He had sold railroad shares shortly before a devastating accident ruined an entire line's reputation. He had acquired mining claims just before rival operations suffered mysterious cave-ins and fatal equipment failures. He had invested heavily in shipping firms mere weeks before competitors endured a string of disasters that cleared the trade routes for his gain. At first, Elenina attributed these coincidences to her husband's extraordinary foresight, an almost supernatural gift for anticipating the future. But the deeper she studied his records, the more troubling the patterns became. The timing was too precise, so exact that it suggested not luck or brilliance, but foreknowledge. Her suspicions deepened when she discovered a locked drawer in Theodore's study, one that neither she nor the staff had ever seen opened. When a locksmith finally forced it, the contents shook her to her core. Inside lay meticulously organized newspaper clippings about industrial accidents, train derailments, and the sudden deaths of rival businessmen, each carefully dated and annotated in Theodore's own hand. More alarming still were the coded telegrams and cryptic letters from men whose names she did not recognize. Many were signed only with initials, discussing solutions to problematic situations and hinting at permanent resolutions to business conflicts. The language was vague, yet its implications were chilling. These were not the papers of an honest businessman. They read more like the records of a criminal conspiracy. Among them, one letter stood out. Dated just 3 weeks before Theodore's death, it was written on fine paper without letterhead and signed only with the initials HK. The letter referenced the Pittsburgh problem, the very phrase Elena remembered hearing whispered at that final, fatal dinner. The letter spoke of the need for decisive action and assured Theodore that their associate had been contacted and understood the urgency of the situation. It concluded with a cryptic reference to a substantial payment arranged for services rendered. Ellenina's hands trembled as she held the correspondence. Heiress and Kensington shared those initials, and she clearly remembered his presence at numerous business dinners where similarly coded conversations had taken place. Could the distinguished banker, who had once comforted her in her grief, truly be involved in something sinister? The thought seemed impossible, yet the evidence before her eyes suggested connections she could not ignore. Her investigation grew increasingly obsessive as winter deepened into the harsh New York January of 1886. Elena spent countless hours in Theodore's study, poring over documents and attempting to decipher the true meaning of his business correspondence. She began mapping timelines, linking Theodore's investment decisions to the disasters that later befell his competitors. The patterns revealed a disturbing picture of systematic manipulation of markets through deliberately orchestrated catastrophes. The more she uncovered, the more isolated she became from her former social circle. Friends who had once vied for invitations to her dinner parties now seemed uneasy in her presence, their conversations strained and artificial whenever she raised the subject of Theodore's affairs. At charity events and social gatherings, Elena noticed how quickly conversations would fall silent when she approached, and how others avoided meeting her gaze. Dr. Henley, the physician who had pronounced Theodore dead, began making increasingly frequent visits, ostensibly to check on her emotional well-being. Yet his concern carried undertones that made Elena deeply uncomfortable. He asked probing questions about how she spent her time, whether she dwelled excessively on the past, and if she experienced nervous symptoms that might require medical treatment. Whenever she mentioned her growing interest in Theodore's business dealings, Dr. Henley's expression darkened with what he claimed was concern for her fragile constitution. Most troubling of all was Elena's growing realization that she was being watched. Strange servants appeared along Fifth Avenue at odd hours, their eyes seeming to follow her every movement. Letters she was certain she had left in precise locations within Theodore's study were subtly shifted, as if examined in her absence. The sensation of constant surveillance became so strong that she began questioning her own perceptions, wondering whether grief was driving her toward paranoia. By the time winter gave way to spring, Elena had uncovered enough to convince her that Theodore's death had been no natural heart attack, and that his fortune had been built through methods that betrayed every moral principle she held dear. Yet the depth of the conspiracy and the power of the men involved made her realize with chilling clarity that her own life might now be in grave danger. The question that haunted her sleepless nights was no longer just what Theodore had done, but who was watching her now, and what they might be willing to do to protect their secrets. The spring of 1886 brought with it a renewed determination, as Elena resolved to move beyond passive observation and take active steps to uncover the truth behind her husband's business dealings. Her transformation from grieving widow to determined investigator had been gradual yet profound, driven by mounting evidence that Theodore's death was tied to something far more sinister than ordinary business rivalry. Her first true breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Margaret O'Brien, the Irish cook who had served the Fairchild household faithfully for nearly 6 years, had always been more observant than most of the staff. Her loyalty to Elelenina had only deepened during the difficult months following Theodore's death. One morning in April, as Elelenina pored over financial documents in the breakfast room, Margaret approached her with visible unease. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Fairchild," Margaret began in her soft Dublin accent, her weathered hands twisting the edge of her apron. "But there's something I've long been meaning to tell you about the night Mr. Godfrey Theodore passed. God rest his soul." Elelenina set aside her papers, giving the woman her full attention. Margaret's eyes flickered with anxiety as she continued. "I was in the kitchen when Dr. Henley left that evening, and I saw him speaking with Mr. Kensington by the garden gate. They didn't know I was watching through the pantry window, but I heard Mr. Kensington say something that's troubled me ever since. Clear as day, he said, 'The dose was perfect. No one will ever suspect.' And then Dr. Henley answered, 'Just remember our agreement about the widow. She must never learn what we know.' They shook hands as though sealing a bargain, ma'am, and I've carried the weight of it ever since." The implications of Margaret's revelation struck Elelenina like a physical blow. If her account was accurate, then Theodore had been murdered, and Dr. Henley had not only been complicit but had played a role in concealing the crime. The dose could only mean poison, delivered with such precision that it mimicked the symptoms of a sudden heart attack. Her grief hardened into cold, focused rage. The very men she had trusted to console her in her darkest hour had in truth orchestrated her husband's death. With this new knowledge, Elelenina began to reassess every detail of that fateful night. She recalled how swiftly Dr. Henley had arrived, almost as if he had been waiting for the summons. She remembered how effortlessly the dinner guests had managed the crisis, their movements too practiced to be natural, suggesting prior rehearsal or experience. And she now understood the anxious expressions that had clouded the table before Theodore collapsed. They had not been shocked, they had been waiting. Determined to uncover the full scope of the conspiracy, she began making discreet inquiries into the men who had attended the dinner. Each discovery only deepened her horror. Heiress and Kensington, she learned, had profited enormously from a string of railroad investments, each coinciding with the inexplicable collapse of competing lines. Marcus Cromwell's shipping empire, meanwhile, had grown steadily through acquisitions of rival companies, ruined by suspicious misfortunes, fires, accidents, and untimely bankruptcies. Together, the picture that emerged was one of ruthless ambition cloaked in respectability, a network of men bound by secrets, and a widow who now understood she had been living among her husband's killers. James Wayright's textile operations had similarly thrived on the misfortunes of competitors, and Eleanor began to notice that all three men shared certain disturbing traits. Their businesses consistently profited from their rivals' disasters. Their success coincided with a remarkable series of accidental deaths among competing businessmen, and their social circles overlapped in ways that suggested careful coordination rather than coincidence. The pattern that emerged was one of systematic market manipulation through violence. These men weren't merely successful businessmen. They were running what could only be described as a murder-for-profit enterprise, eliminating competition through carefully staged assassinations disguised as accidents, suicides, or natural deaths. Theodore had clearly been a central figure in this conspiracy. His analytical mind was perfectly suited to identifying targets and timing attacks for maximum financial gain. Eleanor's discovery of this network explained Theodore's uncanny ability to predict market movements. He hadn't been predicting them. He had been orchestrating them through violence. Every brilliant investment, Every perfectly timed stock purchase, every fortunate coincidence had been built on someone else's murder. The fortune that had provided Eleanor with her luxurious lifestyle, her social position, and her comfortable security had been purchased with blood. As her understanding of the conspiracy deepened, so did her sense of personal danger. She began to notice that her social isolation was becoming more pronounced and deliberate. Invitations to important social gatherings stopped arriving. Longtime friends declined her dinner invitations with flimsy excuses, and business associates who had once sought her company now seemed uneasy even acknowledging her on the street. More ominously, Eleanor realized that her own movements were being closely monitored. Letters disappeared from her study only to reappear in slightly altered positions. Servants she didn't recognize suddenly appeared in her household, recommended by employment agencies connected to Harrison Kensington's office. Her personal correspondence was clearly being intercepted, as she noticed that replies often addressed concerns she had never explicitly written about. The psychological pressure was beginning to erode her daily life. She startled at sudden noises, checked the locks on her doors multiple times each night, and lived with the unshakable feeling of being watched, even within the privacy of her own home. Sleep became elusive as she lay awake, listening to every creak of the old mansion, wondering if tonight would be the night they decided she had learned too much. Dr. Henley's visits increased in frequency, his medical examinations becoming more intrusive and his questions more pointed. He began suggesting that Eleanor's nervous condition might require more aggressive treatment, perhaps even a period of rest at a private sanitarium where she could receive the specialized care her fragile mental state demanded. The implicit threat in these suggestions was unmistakable: comply with their wishes or face involuntary commitment to an asylum where her credibility would be permanently destroyed. Eleanor realized she was racing against time. The conspirators were clearly preparing to silence her, either through institutionalization or by more permanent means. Her only hope lay in gathering enough evidence to expose their crimes before they could eliminate her as a threat. But with each passing day, the danger grew, and Eleanor could feel the net closing around her with terrifying inevitability. The woman, who had once hosted glittering dinner parties for New York's elite, now lived in constant, paralyzing fear. Her home had become a prison, a place where she was both captive and target. The game of cat and mouse had begun in earnest, and Eleanor knew with dreadful clarity that she was playing for her very life. By the summer of 1886, Ella Lenina's investigation had uncovered evidence that reached far beyond the three men she had first suspected. The conspiracy stretched into the highest circles of New York society: judges, police officials, newspaper editors, and even members of the city's Board of Health. What she had exposed was not merely a private arrangement among a handful of wealthy men, but a vast criminal network that had been operating with near impunity for over a decade. Ella Lenina's most damning discovery was a leather-bound ledger hidden behind a false panel in Theodore's office safe. The book, written entirely in Theodore's precise hand, contained meticulous records that could only be described as assassination contracts. Each entry listed the target's name, the supposed justification, phrased coldly as market impediment or competitive interference, the chosen method of elimination, the payment terms, the date of completion. The details were chilling in their precision. Thomas Crawford, a railroad executive, had been resolved through a staged carriage accident on October 15, 1883, which yielded stock acquisitions worth $180,000. Robert Sinclair, a shipping magnate, had been addressed by an apparent suicide on March 22, 1884, allowing for the takeover of three lucrative trade routes. William Hayes, a textile manufacturer, had been concluded by a factory fire that killed him and 17 workers, resulting in insurance windfalls and new business worth over $200,000. Most disturbing of all was the revelation of a network of professional killers identified only by numbers. Agent 7 specialized in staged carriage accidents. Agent 12 arranged industrial disasters and building fires. Agent 23 perfected undetectable poisons. Each assassin had a role, and together they sustained a machine of calculated murder. The ledger made clear that Theodore had been the chief strategist. His task was to select targets whose deaths promised the greatest financial disruption, calculate their vulnerabilities, and determine the most profitable timing for their elimination. The others executed his plans. Kensington managed the money and laundering schemes. Cromwell oversaw the logistics of the killings, and Wainwright ensured the cooperation of corrupt officials so that inquiries never went beyond superficial examinations. Then came the final pages. The last completed entry, dated November 10, 1885, just 1 week before Theodore's own death, involved the elimination of a Pittsburgh steel manufacturer whose factories directly threatened Wainwright's business interests. But it was the unfinished entry that made Ellalinina's blood run cold. E.F. Widow, excessive curiosity, permanent resolution required, arrangements pending. The initials were unmistakable. Ellalinina Fairchild. She herself had been marked for death. Her discovery of her own assassination order filled her with terror, yet at the same time steeled her resolve. The conspiracy was vast, merciless, and closing in, and now she knew the hunter had become the hunted. She now understood that every day she remained in New York brought her closer to a carefully orchestrated death. The conspirators had already been laying the groundwork for her elimination through Dr. Henley's repeated insinuations about her supposed mental instability. Her demise would likely be attributed to suicide brought on by prolonged grief and nervous exhaustion, a tragic but believable end for a widow who had never recovered from her husband's sudden passing. The psychological warfare escalated once Ellalinina realized she had been marked for death. Strange accidents began occurring with alarming frequency. A chandelier in the dining room came crashing down just minutes after she had been standing beneath it. A gas valve in her bedroom was discovered leaking, thankfully noticed by Margaret's keen sense of smell before Ellalinina retired for the night. Her carriage also suffered a mysterious wheel failure while traveling down Fifth Avenue, a mishap that could easily have resulted in serious injury or death. Each incident was carefully staged to appear accidental, yet their timing and repetition made it clear they were deliberate attempts on her life. The conspirators seemed to be experimenting, testing which method might look most natural and arouse the least suspicion. The effect on Ellalinina's psyche was devastating. She found herself unable to trust anything in her environment, from the food she ate to the stairs she climbed. Dr. Henley's visits became increasingly aggressive in their so-called medical assessments. He began bringing along a colleague, Dr. Reginald Steinberg, a specialist in nervous disorders and institutional commitment procedures. Together, they subjected her to lengthy interrogations that focused not on her physical health, but on her mental state. Their questions grew increasingly invasive and accusatory. Did she believe people were plotting against her? Had she developed paranoid delusions about her late husband's business associates? Was she struggling to distinguish between reality and imagination? It became clear to Ellalinina that the doctors were building a medical case for her involuntary commitment to an asylum. Once confined, she would be utterly powerless to expose the conspiracy, and her eventual death could be written off as the natural decline of a disordered mind. The prospect of being trapped in one of the era's infamous private sanitariums, subjected to the primitive and often brutal treatments inflicted on women deemed hysterical, filled her with a terror that eclipsed even her fear of death. Just when it seemed matters could grow no darker, the horror of Ellalinina's situation intensified. If this story is sending chills down your spine, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our work, and don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Now let's uncover what happens next in Eleanor's desperate fight for survival. Her despair drove her to make a choice that would either save her life or hasten her death. She resolved to gather irrefutable proof of the conspiracy and deliver it to authorities beyond the reach of the network. Her plan was bold and perilous. She would document every discovery, create multiple copies of the evidence, and present them simultaneously to federal authorities, major newspapers, and law enforcement officials in other cities. Working in absolute secrecy, Elena spent long nights photographing pages from Theodore's ledger with a small camera she had purchased discreetly. She created detailed, written accounts of everything she had uncovered, including Margaret's testimony about the conversation between Dr. Henley and Kensington. She compiled lists of suspicious deaths that aligned with the conspiracy's profitable investments, building a timeline that revealed the systematic nature of the murder scheme. Eleanor's plan required her to maintain an appearance of normalcy while secretly preparing her evidence. She continued to attend social functions, submitted to Dr. Henley's examinations, and upheld the facade of a grieving widow slowly succumbing to nervous exhaustion. But beneath this careful performance, she was preparing for what she knew would be her only chance to expose the truth and save her life. The stakes could not have been higher. Eleanor was playing a desperate game against opponents who had already proven their willingness to kill without hesitation. Her window of opportunity was closing rapidly as the conspirators prepared their final move against her. The evidence she had gathered would either vindicate her allegations and dismantle one of the most powerful criminal networks in American history, or it would die with her, ensuring their secrets remained buried forever. As summer turned to autumn, Eleanor felt the tension pressing toward its breaking point. The next few days would determine whether justice would finally prevail or whether she would become just another entry in Theodore's ledger of perfectly executed murders. The first week of October 1886 brought unseasonably warm weather to New York City, but Eleanor felt nothing but cold dread as she prepared to carry out her desperate plan. She had arranged to meet with 3 different contacts on the same day: a federal prosecutor who specialized in interstate commerce crimes, the editor of the Herald Tribune, a paper outside the conspirators' control, and a police detective from Philadelphia with no ties to New York's corrupt system. Eleanor's strategy was simple but risky: present her evidence simultaneously to multiple authorities, making it impossible for the conspiracy to suppress all investigations. She had prepared 4 complete sets of documentation, including photographs of Theodore's assassination ledger, copies of the coded correspondence, Margaret's written testimony, and her own detailed analysis linking the murders to specific financial gains. 3 sets would be delivered to her contacts, while the 4th would be hidden in a safety deposit box at a bank beyond the conspirators' influence. On the morning of October 8th, Eleanor rose early and dressed with deliberate care, fully aware this might be her final day of freedom, or her final day alive. She had scheduled her meetings carefully. The federal prosecutor at 10 a.m., the newspaper editor at 2 p.m., and the Philadelphia detective at 5 p.m. Each encounter was set at a different location to minimize the chance that the conspirators could trace her movements and intercept all 3. Her first indication that her plan had been discovered came just as she prepared to leave for her morning appointment. Margaret approached her in obvious distress, reporting that 2 unfamiliar men were stationed at the street corners near the mansion, and that Dr. Henley had arrived unexpectedly, claiming he needed to conduct an urgent medical examination. "He's in the front parlor, ma'am, and he's brought that other doctor with him again," Margaret whispered urgently. "He says you're having a medical emergency and that he must see you immediately. But ma'am, you look perfectly well to me, and his manner is most strange. He seems nervous and keeps checking his pocket watch." Eleanor's heart raced as she realized the conspirators had discovered her plans and were moving to stop her. Dr. Henley's sudden presence, combined with the suspicious men outside, suggested they intended to have her committed at once, preventing her from keeping any of her appointments. Once she was in their custody, under the guise of medical authority, they could ensure her evidence never reached the authorities. Eleanor made a split-second decision that would determine her fate. Rather than confront Dr. Henley directly, she instructed Margaret to tell him she was feeling faint and would need a few moments to compose herself before the examination. Using the servant's stairs, Eleanor quickly retrieved her prepared evidence packets and slipped out through the mansion's rear entrance, which opened onto a narrow alley connecting to 48th Street. Her flight through the streets of Manhattan became a desperate race against time and her pursuers. She could see men following her as she hurried toward the federal building, their presence confirming that the conspiracy had mobilized significant resources to stop her. Eleanor's plan began to unravel when she realized her pursuers seemed to anticipate her destinations, suggesting they had somehow learned the details of her appointments. The federal prosecutor's office dealt the first devastating blow to her hopes. When she arrived at the building, breathless and terrified, she was told that Prosecutor Williams had been called away on an emergency and would not be available for their scheduled meeting. The clerk's explanation seemed rehearsed, and Eleanor noticed he avoided her gaze as he delivered the news. She left the evidence packet anyway, insisting it be given to Williams upon his return, but she had little confidence it would ever reach him. Her afternoon appointment with the newspaper editor proved even more disastrous. At the Herald Tribune offices, she was informed that editor Morrison had suddenly taken ill and been hospitalized that very morning. The timing was too convenient to be mere coincidence, and Eleanor realized the conspiracy's reach extended further than she had feared. They had identified her contacts and neutralized them before her evidence could be presented. Desperation drove her to attempt her final appointment with the Philadelphia detective, even though she suspected it too would fail. Detective Patrick Kelly had agreed to meet her at Grand Central Station before returning to Philadelphia on the evening train after reviewing her evidence. Eleanor arrived early, hoping the public nature of the location might provide some protection from her pursuers. But Detective Kelly proved to be her last hope and her final disappointment when she approached him at their agreed-upon meeting place near the main departure board. Kelly's expression showed barely concealed hostility rather than the professional interest she had expected. His first words confirmed Eleanina's worst fears. "Mrs. Fairchild, I've been contacted by some very concerned parties about your condition. Dr. Henley has explained your situation to me in great detail." Eleanina's blood turned to ice as she realized the conspiracy had reached even this distant contact. Detective Kelly had been compromised, likely through a mixture of bribes and carefully constructed lies about her mental state. The evidence package she had intended to give him would never see the light of day. Her final avenue for justice had been sealed before she could even attempt to use it. "Detective Kelly, please listen to me," Eleanor pleaded, her voice carrying the desperation of a woman who knew she was running out of time. "The evidence I have will prove that my husband and his associates have been murdering people for profit. There's a ledger that documents dozens of assassinations, and I can prove that Theodore was poisoned at our dinner table." Kelly's response was gentle but firm, the tone one might use with a dangerous mental patient. "Ma'am, Dr. Henley has explained about your delusions. You've been under tremendous strain since your husband's passing, and it's affected your ability to think clearly. The best thing for you now is to come with me peacefully. Dr. Henley is waiting outside with an ambulance that will take you to a private facility where you can get the help you need." Eleanina realized with sudden, painful clarity that she had been completely outmaneuvered. The conspirators had anticipated every move she might make, neutralizing her contacts and preparing the final trap that would erase her from society forever. The private facility Kelly mentioned would be her prison, and eventually her grave, a place where her death could be attributed to the progressive decline of her mental health. In that moment of absolute despair, Elelena made one last desperate decision. She would not go quietly to her destruction. If she was going to die, she would at least attempt to create a public scene that might draw attention to her plight. With sudden violence, she tore away from Detective Kelly and sprinted toward the crowded main concourse of the station, screaming about murder and conspiracy at the top of her lungs. "They killed my husband. Harrison Kensington and Marcus Cromwell are murderers. They've been killing people for money." Elelena's voice echoed through the vast space as dozens of travelers turned to stare at the elegantly dressed woman who appeared to be suffering a complete mental breakdown. "Dr. Henley poisoned Theodore. They're trying to kill me to keep me quiet." The scene that followed was exactly what the conspirators had planned for. Elelena's public hysteria, witnessed by scores of respectable citizens, provided perfect evidence of her supposed mental instability. Dr. Henley appeared as if on cue, flanked by two orderlies in white coats who approached Eleanor with the practiced efficiency of men accustomed to restraining violent patients. "Please, everyone, stand back," Dr. Henley announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying professional authority and deep compassion. This poor woman had been suffering from severe nervous exhaustion since her husband's death. Though we were there to help her, she had been plagued by paranoid delusions, convinced that people were plotting to harm her. Elelena fought furiously against the orderlies who restrained her, shouting wild accusations that to onlookers sounded increasingly deranged. The more desperately she tried to explain the conspiracy, the more her words seemed to validate Dr. Henley's assessment of her mental state. The very evidence she attempted to present, the vastness of the murder network, the involvement of respected businessmen, the systematic nature of the killings, came across as the elaborate fantasies of a mind untethered from reality. As the orderlies carried Elelena toward the waiting ambulance, she caught sight of Harrison Kensington lurking in the shadows by the station entrance. His expression bore the satisfaction of a man whose carefully laid plans had reached their intended conclusion. In that instant, Eleanor realized that everything, her isolation, the staged accidents, the examinations, and now this final public breakdown, had been orchestrated to achieve this very result. The last image she saw before the ambulance doors shut was Detective Kelly shaking hands with Dr. Henley, accepting what appeared to be a thick envelope of cash. Her final hope for justice withered as she understood that even her supposedly independent ally had been bought by the very men she sought to expose. Elelena Catherine Fairchild was committed to the Westchester Private Sanitarium on October 8, 1886, under the authority of Dr. Pearl Henley and Dr. Reginald Steinberg. The facility, hidden away in a remote part of Westchester County, specialized in treating wealthy patients suffering from nervous disorders and conditions too embarrassing for their families to confront. It was precisely the kind of discreet institution where inconvenient individuals could vanish without attracting unwanted scrutiny. The sanitarium's records, carefully maintained by its staff, documented Elena's rapid decline from the moment she arrived. According to Dr. Henley's initial assessment, the patient was afflicted with acute paranoid hysteria brought on by prolonged grief and nervous exhaustion. Her claims of murder conspiracies were classified as elaborate delusions, characteristic of the fragile female mind under extreme distress. Her treatment followed the prevailing protocols of the time for handling difficult female patients: confinement to a private room, prohibition of visitors beyond immediate family, of which she had none, and a regimen of cold water treatments, prolonged bed rest, and steadily increasing doses of medicinal opiates to subdue her agitation. Her requests to contact authorities or send letters were denied on medical grounds, with Dr. Henley insisting that such activities would only reinforce her dangerous delusions. Margaret O'Brien, the Fairchild family's loyal cook, made repeated efforts to visit Elenina during her first weeks in confinement. Each time she was turned away with the explanation that the patient was far too unstable to receive visitors. Margaret's persistence eventually secured her a meeting with Dr. Henley himself, who calmly assured her that Elenina's condition was deteriorating rapidly and that outside contact might provoke violent episodes, endangering both patient and staff. What Margaret did not realize was that her own fate had already been sealed. On November 15, 1886, exactly 1 month after Elenina's commitment, Margaret O'Brien was found dead in her modest apartment near the Fairchild mansion. The official police report attributed her death to a gas leak from a faulty stove, a tragic accident that claimed the life of a hard-working immigrant woman. Yet the timing ensured that the sole witness to the exchange between Dr. Henley and Harrison Kensington would never live to testify. Eleanor's own end followed with the cruel inevitability the conspirators had always intended. On December 3, 1886, after nearly 2 months of confinement and escalating doses of laudanum, Elenina Catherine Fairchild was found dead in her room at the Westchester Sanitarium. Dr. Henley's official report attributed her death to cardiac failure brought on by the progressive deterioration of her nervous system and the toxic effects of prolonged mental anguish. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Henley and countersigned by Dr. Steinberg, made no mention of the massive dose of morphine that had actually stopped Elenina's heart. The drugs had been administered during what medical records described as therapeutic treatment for severe agitation, but in truth, it had been a carefully calculated execution disguised as medical care. Elenina's funeral was a modest affair, attended primarily by former servants and a handful of society acquaintances who felt socially obligated to appear. Harrison Kensington, Marcus Cromwell, and James Wainwright were present, playing the roles of concerned friends who had supposedly tried and failed to help a troubled widow overcome her tragic decline into madness. Their expressions of sympathy were masterful performances, striking the perfect balance of sorrow and relief that her suffering had finally ended. The New York Times ran a brief obituary portraying Elenina as a cautionary tale of the dangers of uncontrolled grief. The article claimed that the sudden loss of her beloved husband had triggered a mental collapse, leading to increasingly bizarre delusions of business conspiracies and assassination plots. It praised Dr. Henley's heroic efforts to treat her condition, while remarking that some forms of female hysteria resisted even the most advanced medical interventions. Eleanor's estate was quickly settled by Cornelius Dalton, the appointed executor of her will. The Fairchild fortune, valued at over $2 million, was distributed according to Theodore's prior instructions, arrangements that heavily benefited his former business partners. Harrison Kensington's bank received substantial deposits. Marcus Cromwell secured profitable shipping investments at below-market prices, and James Wainwright gained control of textile operations that perfectly complemented his growing business empire. The mansion at 847th Avenue was sold to a railroad magnate from Chicago, while all of Theodore's business records were deliberately destroyed during the estate settlement. Cornelius Dalton explained that the documents contained sensitive financial information which, if made public, could damage the reputations of various associates. The destruction was carried out under Harrison Kensington's supervision, ensuring that no trace remained of the assassination ledger or the coded correspondence that had once revealed the conspiracy's existence. With Elenina's death, the murder-for-profit network pressed forward with renewed confidence. The elimination of both Theodore Fairchild and his widow had proven the organization's ability to neutralize internal threats while preserving their public facades as respectable men of commerce. Over the following years, The conspiracy expanded its reach, eventually extending its influence throughout the Northeast and into the industrial centers of the Midwest. Dr. Pivel Henley's reputation was greatly enhanced by his handling of the Fairchild case, and he soon became a sought-after specialist in treating the nervous disorders of wealthy women. His private practice flourished, and he developed particular expertise in cases where female patients exhibited paranoid tendencies that often required institutional care. The doctor's success rate in treating such conditions was considered remarkable, though his patients had an unusually high mortality rate, a fact he attributed to the severity of their illnesses. The Westchester Private Sanitarium continued to operate for another 15 years, serving as a discreet repository for inconvenient individuals whose presence had become problematic for powerful interests. Its records were destroyed in a suspicious fire in 1902, erasing all evidence of the questionable deaths that had occurred within its walls. By the early 1900s, most of the original members of the murder conspiracy had died of natural causes, their secrets buried with them beneath elaborate monuments celebrating their supposed contributions to American business and society. Harrison Kensington was remembered as a philanthropist who donated millions to build hospitals and schools. Marcus Cromwell's shipping empire became a cornerstone of American international trade. James Wright's textile operations employed thousands of workers and helped establish the industrial foundations of the modern economy. Yet, their true legacy endured in the criminal networks they had established, which continued to operate long after their deaths. The methods they pioneered, systematic elimination of business rivals through violence, the corruption of medical and legal authorities, and the use of mental health institutions to silence inconvenient witnesses, became templates that criminal organizations would replicate for generations. Elena Fairchild's story faded into obscurity, remembered only as a footnote in the occasional academic study of women's mental health during the Gilded Age. Her name never appeared in history books, her warnings were ignored, and her evidence was lost forever. The brave woman who risked everything to expose one of America's most dangerous conspiracies became just another statistic in the era's epidemic of female hysteria and nervous breakdowns. This mystery reveals how power and wealth can corrupt even the most fundamental institutions of justice and medicine, transforming them into weapons against the innocent. The story of Elena Fairchild reminds us that throughout history, those who dared to expose the crimes of the powerful often paid the ultimate price for their courage. Her tragedy is a chilling reminder that the most terrifying monsters are not supernatural beings, but ordinary men who convince themselves that their wealth and status place them above the laws that govern everyone else. What do you think of this story? Do you believe such conspiracies could have thrived in the shadows of America's Gilded Age? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts on Elena's tragic fate. If you enjoyed this tale of historical horror and want more dark mysteries from America's past, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves exploring the sinister secrets that history tried to bury. Until next time, remember, the most frightening stories are often the ones that could be true.